the Mayor touched briefly on the Copenhagen process, right? I'm not going to talk about climate change. There's a whole debate in this. Oh, if it comes up in questions, I'll express a view. But it's not really what I'm here to talk about. I'm just going to make one observation about that. In his very first press conference as the new president of the European Union, Herman van Rompuy, so did anyone know who Herman van Rompuy was before? Does anyone know who he is now? All right, he's the president of the European Council. He made a fascinating observation. He said, 2009 is the first year of global governance. It started with the G20 summit, and at the Copenhagen conference, we will take a substantial step towards the common global administration of our planet. Now, as I say, I'm not. The climate change is a long, complicated, tricky issue. I envy the certainty of people on both sides of that debate. I think it's more ambiguous than people sometimes make out. All I'm saying is look at the way in which that agenda is being leapt on by people who have a different agenda. An agenda of removing decision-making further from the electorate and concentrating it in the hands of remote elites. And we have already seen that happen in the G20, when they speak about creating these great institutions of global economic management. What that means in practice is that the national elected representatives will have fewer powers, and the global unelected technocrats will have more powers. And you know what? They are going to use those additional powers in ways that are deleterious to the public weal. They are going to be using those powers on a basis predicated on their belief that more government and higher spending are the solution to every problem. The last G20 summit ended with this great boast that they were injecting $1 trillion into the world economy, right? Injecting $1 trillion into the world economy in order to stimulate. Where do you get $1 trillion from, if not, in the broadest sense of the word, from the world economy, right? It's not coming from Mars. It's not coming from Saturn's rings. So what we're really talking about when we say injecting $1 trillion into the world economy is taking money out of people's pockets or purses and spending it on their behalf through national or international technocracies. Now, my friends, if that had been the better way of running a country's economy, we'd have lost the Cold War. I'd be talking to you in Russian now. The truth is that the best possible kind of stimulus is to allow individuals to spend their money as they wish. We have spent, the figures came out about 3 weeks ago in the UK of how much the bank bailouts and nationalisations had cost us. 189 billion pounds, about 9% of our GDP, went to rescuing some very wealthy individuals from the consequences of their own mistakes. Stimulus. Well, all right. What's the effect of it? We're still in recession. We're going to be in recession for longer than you are. Our debt is worse than yours. What could we have done with 9% of GDP? Imagine the stimulus effect if we'd said, OK, with that sum of money, we can abolish corporation tax and abolish the sales tax and still take a couple of pence off income tax. What would have been the stimulus effect of that on an economy? Now, of course, you might say to me, well, what would have happened then? What if there'd been no bailout? What if the banking system had gone into meltdown? Then where would we be? It's a tricky question to answer, right? Because we're obviously dealing here with counterfactuals. I can't prove or demonstrate what would have been the effect of not bailing out the failed banks and not throwing that amount of money at the financial system. But I think I can illustrate, or at least trace in rough forms, how an alternative might have worked with a little story drawn from this country. Does anybody remember a minister some dozen years ago called Maurice McTeague? He was a minister. He's now become a think tank person. He's working in Washington, right? He told me an absolutely fascinating thing just after the bailout. You will all remember, I'm sure, when the subsidies were taken away from farmers here, when the agrarian subsidies were withdrawn. The immediate impact of that was that a lot of farmers found themselves in negative equity. Land prices had collapsed, and the banks were faced with the prospect of a series of foreclosures and auctions and repossessions. If it had gone ahead, they said, there would be a total meltdown. They used exactly the same argument that the bankers used in Washington and in London. If you don't bail us out, the consequences would be unthinkable. The whole banking system will collapse. The economy won't be able to stand up under the strain. Well, they picked the wrong government to say this to in New Zealand. The government here said, well, we don't do bailouts. We don't do intervention like that. You're going to have to come up with some other alternative. So the bankers went off, and then they came back and they said, Minister, this is really serious. If you don't give us the kind of support that we're looking for, there will be no banking sector and therefore no economy. And the minister said, yeah, that's your problem, but guys, what are you going to do about it? And of course, once it was put to them in those terms, the bankers went away and said, God, it is our problem. What are we going to do about it? And of course, they came up with a solution. And their solution was that they rescheduled debt, and they allowed people who had heavy mortgages to pay only the interest in the short term. Within 3 or 4 years, much earlier than anyone had predicted, land prices had recovered, crisis over. Now, McTeague's argument was this one. If the then government had given the financial institutions what they were asking for, it would almost certainly have provoked precisely the crisis that they were warning against. What you saw in New Zealand was a classic example of what economists call spontaneous order. The problem looked after itself. And political interference would have made it worse. My friends, there is almost no crisis in the world so severe that it cannot be exacerbated by state intervention. And that includes the recent one here. Now, there is a real problem. There is a structural problem with why these things happen. And it's, let's call it the something must be done fallacy. Of all the phrases in politics, the one I dislike most of all is something must be done, or it's often phrased by half-clever journalists as doing nothing is not an option. Has that ever been true? Doing nothing is almost always an option. And very often it is the correct option. But the trouble is that in the little political media bubble, if you have two people in a moment of crisis, when nobody's quite certain, when everyone's dashing around saying what happens next, you have one of them saying, there's nothing much to be done. And the other one says, I know, I've got the answer. Well, of course, your instinct is to let the second guy at least have a go, isn't it? Of course, by the time you find out that his having a go was calamitous and that the result has been that your children are going to be working his debt off for the rest of their lifetime, it's too late. And so you have this structural problem, that there is an intrinsic disadvantage. The way things stand, or at least within the media, there is an intrinsic disadvantage in small c conservatism. It's much more popular, much easier, because of the problem of, let's call it the problem of dispersed costs and concentrated gains, the fact that the winners are immediate and visible and the losers, being the taxpayers, are invisible. There is always an advantage in the guy who wants to expand the state. I say within the political media bubble because actually I'm not sure that the general public believes this. Mine was one of the very few voices in my country being raised against the bailouts and nationalizations at the time. Lots of people are wise after the event now, but very few people in that early week, very few politicians anyway, I can't think of any others, were saying this is a terrible mistake. It's, don't do it now. And I remember a very senior person in my party saying, Hannan, the only people arguing against this bailout are you and the Adam Smith Institute, which is an organization not dissimilar from yours. And about a month later, I went back to him armed with a front page headline in the Daily Telegraph, which had just conducted a new opinion poll. And I said, look, it turned out to be me and the Adam Smith Institute and 86% of the British electorate. And I suspect it would have been the same thing in the US, in Europe, in all these other places where people were never really asked whether they thought that the best use of their tax money would be to bail out banks who had made a mistake. So why did it happen? Well, here I come back to my point about New Zealand being lucky in being a working democracy. It happened because there was no vote, there was no consultation. And here the United Kingdom is in an unusually bad position. Through a quirk of history, the British Prime Minister in the 21st century has inherited, more or less intact, the powers that once attached to a Georgian monarch. So we have this huge, uncontrolled executive. We have a very weak parliament.